Well, thank you for inviting me to be here, and thank you for the wonderful introduction that was provided to me. And I do want to give a little bit of context eventually about the comments that were just made, but let me just, before I get started, again, my name is John Saunders. I'm with M&F Bank, and I do have to have this safe harbor language here that if I do say something that is forward-looking statements, expectations, and they don't come true in the future, you cannot sue me. You cannot sue M&F Bank. And also, the source of all this information that I'm about to present is from the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So for introductions, you mentioned earlier that we have this connection. So my previous employer was Tompkins Financial Corporation. It's about an $8 billion asset bank headquartered in Ithaca, New York. And she went to SUNY Cortland. And if you don't know the Finger Lakes region of New York State, Cortland is the town right next to Ithaca. And they have this huge competition, this football game called the Cortaga Jug, where Ithaca College plays SUNY Cortland, her alma mater. And it's a big, big rivalry. So that's what she was referring to. And so how did I get here? My wife is a professor, and she was a professor at Cornell University. She is clearly the brains of our operation.
Just take the mic out of the stand.
Do you want me to hold it?
Yeah, just hold it.
Is that easier? Better? Oh, sorry. So my wife is a professor, clearly the brains of our operation. She's a professor at Cornell University, Ivy League institution. Had some health challenges, and we decided to move south. And she got this great opportunity to be a professor at Duke University. She's a professor at Duke, and here I am in the banking industry. I appreciate Kenneth not mentioning any years in terms of how long I've been working, but for reference sake, I graduated from college in 1992, so I've been working for quite a while. And we moved to Durham, North Carolina, and I got this great opportunity to be the chief operating officer of M&F Bank. And you mentioned something funny in your speech where you said don't wait till you have your living room is in order before you invite people over. Well, I just moved to Durham a few months ago, and the living room's not in order, and we haven't invited anyone over yet either. So I appreciate the warm welcome from everyone. Everyone I've met here in North Carolina in general have been extremely welcoming to me, so just thank you, and thank you, Kenneth, for the invitation. So M&F Bank, just briefly, I'm just so humbled to work at M&F Bank. It's a minority depository institution, as Kenneth mentioned. We're tiny. We're a $450 million asset bank, which, put it in perspective, the PNC, what are we, about a branch, right? The size of a PNC branch. So, but we have 7 locations across the state of North Carolina, 2 in Raleigh, 2 in Durham, 1 in Greensboro, 1 in Winston-Salem, and 1 in Charlotte. But I'm humbled because in our boardroom we have pictures of all the previous CEOs. And you think about, in 1907, a handful of African-American men sat in a room together and said, you know what we should do? We should start a bank. It's humbling to me. Like, I can't even imagine doing that today. But in 1907, they started this bank, and it's been thriving ever since. And I think this year we're having an outstanding year financially. We're a publicly traded company. It's all about relationships. It's all about partnerships. It's all about community. And a customer who also happens to be a Morehouse graduate has already approached me saying how much they love working with M&F Bank. Well, we appreciate you, so thank you. So I was asked by Kenneth to talk about the North Carolina banking landscape and all the joy, right, of let's talk about the banking landscape at 9 o'clock in the morning. So I said, let's put an interesting twist on this. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Charlie Munger, investor, recently passed, 99 years old, right-hand man of Warren Buffett, one of the most famous sort of value investors ever. So I said, let's take that perspective. Instead of just studying North Carolina banks in sort of a boring, bland way, let's take the perspective of we're an investment firm. We're a value investor, meaning we're not looking to buy Apple, some super high-tech growth stock. We're a value investor. We have a long-term focus. We're headquartered in North Carolina, and we focus on North Carolina. So would you invest in a North Carolina bank? Or in North Carolina banks in general? And my thesis is that North Carolina banks are well capitalized. We're growing earnings. We're prudently growing loans, and we're poised for growth. So put that into context. So this is a clumsy effort to study North Carolina banks so that we try to make it not so boring. See if it works. Okay. So the first thing if you work at, and if there are any investment professionals here, please, this is a clumsy effort, and please don't take any investment advice from me. That's not my role. But if I were an investment professional, the first thing I would do is I would say, well, what's happened with bank stocks over the past 5 years or so? And I have a pointer, but I don't know how to use it, but if you look at the sort of back in 2019, from 2019 to today, this is an index for bank stocks over that period of time. And you see the first big drop was COVID, right? So you saw bank stocks go, COVID happened. Then you see this wonderful uptick, right? So what about the beginning of 2022? What happened then? Inflation, right? Right at that point, what did the Fed do? They started raising rates. So bank stocks, I wish I had a long-term chart and had more time to put this together. If you look at bank stocks over time, when rates go up, what happens to bank stocks? They go down because there's this pressure that's been put on earnings for banks when rates go up. So then in 2023, you see the staunch drop, war, right? Ukraine, and now today, everything that's happening, all the geopolitical concerns. But you see now, it looks like we might be poised to go up a little bit here. And that's fascinating to me. That gets me excited. Again, if I were an investment professional, I would say, well, and I'm thinking about investing in banks, well, what's the economic conditions? So inflation today is 3.2%, down from 9.1% in June of 2022, which is where you saw that staunch drop in bank stocks. The Federal Reserve's target is 2%. At that point in time, we saw bank stocks at its peak. Interest rates were at 0 to 0.25% in March 2022, but today, we're talking about the Fed funds rate. Today, that's at 5.25% to 5.5%. And unemployment, again, in North Carolina, we're doing better than the country. We're at 3.4% versus 3.9% in the US. And GDP is at about 5%. So what's in the news? We've had some challenges in the banking sector in the nation, but not in North Carolina. We had some bank failures earlier in 2023. And here's some things that are just some things that are in the news that may be negatively impacting banks or the perspective on whether or not banks are doing well. Biggest things on this list to me are, of course, interest rates, inflation, recession, those geopolitical concerns, of course. When I say that, I mean war and things that are just out of our control. As managers of banks, we just don't control those things. But, where are interest rates going? Is inflation subsiding? Those are huge concerns that I won't say they keep me up at night, but they keep me up at night. So remember, my investment thesis was, I think North Carolina banks are really strong, poised for growth. So what's happening in the trends? And there was an appendix to this that had all these charts that I put together that actually, quote unquote, prove some of my views. But in North Carolina today, we have 42 banks headquartered in North Carolina. The 28 banks that are over $1 billion in assets and 14 banks that are under $1 billion in assets. M&F Bank is one of those 14. So when I talk about larger banks and smaller banks, larger banks are calling them banks with assets over $1 billion. So these larger banks, since 2020, around COVID time, their assets have grown 15%. Smaller banks, their assets have declined substantially. And I think that's, some of these themes you'll see as the impact of COVID on the banking sector are real. Some of the larger banks, they pulled back during COVID. So you might see this astronomical growth since COVID. Deposit growth is similar. Large banks, their deposits have grown 8.7%. Small banks are down 22%. Just a note on deposits. I know there's some fellow bankers in here. We're nice to each other while we're in public, but in private, it's war. It's war for deposits. When interest rates have climbed as high as they have, we fight for deposits in a very gentlemanly, nice way. Loan growth. So large banks, again, they grew 19%. Small banks declined. Again, this is the impact of COVID. I think some larger banks may have pulled back during COVID, and smaller banks captured some of that growth. But I do think, again, I did mention that there's hyper competition for deposits, and I do think loan growth is going to slow down for the entire industry. Again, these themes, these bullets are, I think, ways to demonstrate that the banking industry, how sort of equity analysts analyze banks in a general way. So we talked about asset growth, deposit growth, loan growth. Now we talk about some other key sort of metrics that these analysts might look at. So liquidity metrics, and this is a very basic look at liquidity, but one of the metrics that's used is a loan to deposit ratio. So if you are a bank and you have 100% loan to deposit ratio, meaning you have the same number of loans and the same number of deposits, that means you don't really have capacity to make more loans. So in our industry, you don't want to be that high. So, but in our industry today, in North Carolina in particular, if you look at liquidity, large banks have 60% loan to deposit ratio. So there's opportunity to grow loans. And small banks are about 79%. Again, still there's opportunity to grow loans. What's nice, again, my thesis that banks are growing earnings. Net income is up for both small banks and large banks, and return on assets are up since 2020. So we're performing incredibly well. This term net interest margin, in case you're not familiar with the term. So let's talk real generic terms. How do banks make money? You loan money out, so you earn a yield on those loans, and you have deposits, where you pay depositors some type of interest rate. So there's a yield minus your cost. That's your net interest margin. Very simplistic, but it is followed by everybody in the banking industry. And so you have to imagine in a rising rate environment, yields on the loans that we make, they increase. Now, the cost of funds in a rising rate environment, they increase as well. and I don't know if my charts are in here, but it's more of a hockey stick on the cost of deposits, because those, again, it's hyper-competitive. Those costs have increased faster than the yields on the loans that we make. But the net interest margin is overall better than it was in 2020 for both small banks and large banks. Right now, for big banks, it's about 3%, and for small banks, it's about 3.95%, which doesn't sound like much, but it's significant. This next theme of credit quality, if I get into technical, I apologize, but I've studied banks for a long time, and over time, if you look over the long term, like a 25, 30-year horizon, and you say, well, what's the key to success for a bank? What do the top performers in banks do? The number one metric that pops out, it like jumps out, it's glaring, is they have outstanding credit quality. And what that means is they don't make bad loans. Banks that make bad loans, they fail. They are not consistently long-term top performers. So in North Carolina, what's wonderful is our credit quality is outstanding, right? So when you look at a very generic metric called non-performing assets to assets, in North Carolina, the big banks are at 0.3% of their assets are non-performing, and small banks are 0.2%. And that is outstanding. And to defend bankers for a second, if you have a bank that has sort of a 2% non-performing assets to asset ratio, they get torpedoed. Just imagine if whatever industry you're in, that 98% or 99% or 99.8% of the time, you have to be right. And that's the banking industry. So kudos to us for getting it right. Lastly, I would say the banking industry here in North Carolina, we're in an incredibly strong capital position. It's looking at, and capital is a word that's thrown out quite a bit in the banking industry and how it's analyzed. Very simplistic look at capital. We just said take a bank's equity and divide it by its assets. The baseline metric in the industry, let's say it's about 6%. It's not a regulatory capital ratio, but just about 6%. Here in North Carolina, the larger banks are at 9.5%, and the small banks are at about 11%. So, again, clumsy effort to study banks and from a value investor's perspective, but I just wanted to let the audience know that the banking industry here in North Carolina is strong. It's diverse. It's poised for growth. We're not capital constrained. Again, highly competitive, which for people not in the banking industry is a good thing. And I think we're in a very strong position. Anyone want to debate that? So, and lastly, Kenneth asked me to talk about entrepreneurs and access to capital. Normally, they don't really talk about that with banks. But so I just briefly, I think folks throw out the term entrepreneur liberally. Entrepreneur means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, from the person who scratches down their drawings or notes on a napkin to someone who is an accomplished business owner and has sold businesses, and so it's everything in between, from wanting to raise an extreme amount of money to just wanting to raise a small amount of money. So what I would suggest is maybe here are a couple websites. If there are any entrepreneurs here in the state of North Carolina that are looking to learn more about ways to raise capital, I would suggest going to these two websites. I think as a bank, we never turn away a customer, right? You just don't do it. But if you're an entrepreneur and you don't, it's harder for us to loan you money as opposed to some other aspect, some other ways that you can actually get access to capital than sort of a small community bank. So please feel free to take a look at those two websites for more information. So with that, I'm